Believe it or not, this is Jeff Tew. Jeff and I started Space 30 years ago, and we met at a planning board meeting. When I started attending meetings, we were just kind of listening to what the planning board was saying and not saying, and realizing they weren't even asking sometimes the right questions. It wasn't even a matter of agreeing or disagreeing with what they said, but they weren't even asking fully the questions about a lot of development that was happening, you might know, in Stony Point during the early 90s was on the steep slope areas. A lot of the flatlands had been developed, but more of the concentration of development happened in the southern part of the county. And as it was working its way up here, of course, we are the entry to the Hudson Highlands, you might know that, and the terrain here is very different than it is in Spring Valley and Nanuet, which is in a valley, right? So the terrain here is different, and as builders were beginning to build up on the steep slopes, it caused a lot of issues in terms of erosion on the sides of the slopes. The Cedar Pond Brook, which is right across the street from here, the developments of the homes that are right across the street, all the erosion came into that Cedar Pond Brook and ended up going into the reservoir, which eventually had to close. So we lost a million gallon a day water resource, which we could use today, extra water, but that reservoir closed because the equipment that they had for filtering it was clogged with the sedimentation that came down off the mountains. So we saw these things and said to the people in the town, people have to get involved and just pay attention to what's going on. This is a root part of our country's history, and I just want to, Jeff is here today to talk about that. Jeff started Space with me 30 years ago, but he also went on upstate New York to become a history teacher. This is what we looked like 30 years ago. I was 35, I just turned 65.
I was 29.
He was 29, so we were young and idealistic, but we haven't changed. But the thing is, we talk about some of these things, about the importance of people getting involved. And one of the things that we had was our first flyer that we put out, February 24th, 1990. And some of the things that we put in that was, as Stony Pointers, we share the pride of knowing that we live in a town that's rich in history and scenic beauty, but the facing character of our town is being changed forever by developers who are more interested in the profits than in the welfare of our community. This could have been written yesterday, by the way. As a result, we are beginning to see the effects of overdevelopment, including higher taxes, traffic congestion, eyesores around town. So that as citizens, we are concerned about this, and we have about the future of our town, and we want to maintain the quality of life in Stony Point and keep it an affordable place to live. We want to put the word public back in the term public official and planning back in the term planning board. We would like to see our town planning board look at development not as separate projects, but to consider their total environmental impact on the future of our town. So we're not against development, we're about thoughtful development, people thinking about what we're doing so we can progress in a way that's not going to come back and cause us problems. And today's Washington's birthday, so we invited Jeff to come and speak. Jeff is a descendant of a British soldier that fought in the Battle of Stony Point, and also I found out more recently also an American soldier. So he's a descendant of soldiers from both sides of that battle. So I'd like to hand the program over to Jeff to do a little introduction of what he'd like to say about Washington's birthday and the history that happened right here in Stony Point several years ago. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you, George. I think it is fitting on the occasion of George Washington's birthday that I start off my greeting with the greeting that he gave friends and fellow citizens in his farewell address. I count you to be friends and fellow citizens. And as Americans, we look to George Washington as a model for what we hold to be those ideals of the American Revolution. The most important event politically in the history of planet Earth. And I'm not saying that lightly because I'm American and, rah, rah, America. I'm saying that because the history of this country is key to the history not only of Europe, but of Africa, Asia, and all of those things. And you can see that today in the aspirations of people who want to be Americans. They see our ideals, and they want to be part of a beautiful, we're blessed with the bounty of our land, the North American continent in which we inhabit. And by the way, as Americans, there are Americans on the North American continent, but there are also Americans in the South American continent. That's the continental part of my presentation, because we all have a spirit, and that came out of particularly Western Europe and the culture of Western Europe, that has given people the right, a God-given right, not a government-given right, not a king-given right, to govern themselves. And what I'm here today to do is present the history of which I love and which I found personally, and all of you out here have a personal history, I'm sure. And I encourage you, as I encourage my students for many years, and still do when I do my programs, to go back into your family history. You never know who you're going to be related to. And it's part of your DNA. So I am here to talk about a tale of two Tews. One on the British side and one on the American side. But before that, I am not George Washington. I am playing Captain Tew or Continental Officer Tew. I could be on the British side or the American side, and we'll get into that in a little bit. However, for your edification, I have discovered through the modern technology that you enjoy that I can bring George Washington back here. Would you like to meet him? Now, unfortunately, like all of us, he shrunk with age. This is the Hasbro G.I. Joe action figure George Washington. And the interesting about that is, when I was a young boy, you would get G.I. Joes and things like that. And they didn't call them dolls, they called them action figures. Okay. So I purchased this many, many years ago. This is George, as most people see him, this is in his Continental uniform, as Commander-in-Chief, and that's a title we still have for our present president and future presidents and past presidents. Because that's an interesting thing, and we'll get back to why that's important. So people recognize George like this. Also, young people, when I go to schools, they get a laugh. But this is not how George Washington looked like at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Like George and I, he wasn't brown-haired, he was kind of a reddish brown hair. And when he was at Newburgh, when they were watching the British Army after the Battle of Yorktown, because the British still had an army down in New York City, which they could have any time started the actual conflict again. Lord Cornwallis and Yorktown was a defeat for the British Army, but it wasn't the only army they had. The larger army is in New York City. And has anybody been to Newburgh, to the Washington headquarters? I went last week, and I'll tell you, a good friend of mine, John Koopman, he looks like George Washington. He does it every year. So if you want to research him, really great people. So while not Washington, I want to embolden you all, and I want to talk about the fact that his spirit is in all of us. I'm not getting into ethereal religious things, but when we talk about what we as Americans think about when the name George Washington comes to mind, that's what we're going to discuss. So I'm going to put George here in an honored spot. I think when he returns back, as we get bigger. Washington, by the way, is 6'4" almost. He is, whenever you see anything, he is always the largest, the biggest, tallest man in the world. By the way, before I go into all the particulars, you might notice, why are these folks so oddly dressed? Have you no hat, sir? Your women look good because their elbows are exposed. Other parts, they had no problem exposing, but your ankles and your elbows, you did not want to, ladies. And Martha Washington is as important as George. Ladies, behind every great man, there's a woman telling him when he's doing wrong. And Martha Washington and George Washington, as a kind of a model of the Americans, is a great thing. She suffered great hardships. People don't know this. I just found out some stuff about loss of children and things like that. And any parent will tell you that's the most horrific thing to do. Her husband died. She was a wealthy widow. Hi, Martha. We don't know what George's motivations were, but she was an attractive, wealthy widow. And if it were not for Martha, George, by the way, think about the psychological effects of being a commander-in-chief at war. Away from your beloved Mount Vernon. And George Washington loved Mount Vernon. In fact, when he left, he was talking about, he wanted to go back to his farm. He sacrificed and gave up so much that we don't understand. But when we look at the facts of history, here's an interesting fact. I'm kind of skipping ahead, but I want to say this important. Think of George Washington as the Jeff Bezos of our time, the wealthiest one, the wealthiest, Bill Gates, or the other one that we're talking about incessantly on the television and in politics. But he is arguably one of the wealthiest men in the world, or in the colonies at that time. Okay? He starts out as a young action man. George Washington is always a man of action. And I want to get to that because it's part of the wider reason for why I'm here. George Washington starts out 21 years old as a major fighting for the Virginia province, the provincials they call it. He's not a British soldier. He's in the British Empire because God save the king. This is a flag that has flown over the colonies. It's an amalgam of different nations. The first flag that flew over the colonies here is the Cross of St. George. That's the red cross on a white background. The Pilgrims had that flag. The second cross on this flag is the white diagonal cross on a blue background. That is, Scotland shall be free. That is the cross of St. Andrew. The third, this flag, but I must mention it because one of my ancestors, as well as my heritage, is the red thin diagonal flag. It is the cross of St. Patrick, faith and regard to you. If you see the History Channel, of which I've been on, and counseled them, and they have the modern British flag in an 18th century production, somebody did not do their homework. This is not a pet peeve, and I understand they had it, but the flag they have on our sign would not be the flag of the British at the time of the Battle of Stony Point, for which it is. So I don't know if I would like to paint out the St. Patrick Cross, but I don't want that because I'm Irish. So this is called the King's Colors. Everybody say King's Colors. Very good, King's Colors. It is not the Union Jack that Mick Jagger talks about in his song. A Union Jack is the King's Colors on a ship. And when it's on the Jack staff, that's where the term Union Jack comes from. So there's a song. This is the audience participation part. If you know the present song, made a few hundred years ago, that uses the same tune, wait for it, and then raise your hand. Because this is to get you into the mindset. You're in the 21st century. Good God, this is such a fast century. You're in the 21st century and you think like a 21st century person. But you have to think about this from George Washington and everybody, everything they knew. And this was the song that shows that. God save great George our King, long live our noble King. God save the King, send him victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the King. What tune was adopted and a song was created to the tune of God Save the King?
Battle of the Republic.
Close?
What's it
But
called?
no cigar.
What's it called?
Freedom rings.
What's it called?
Battle of the Republic.
Bum, bum, bum,
We tell the two of our time.
liberty of the rising. Sing it. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring. And that's important. And this is why when I teach music and songs. I'm not the greatest singer. I'm loud though. But when I try to impress upon the young people, and you could talk to your grandchildren, your children, not so young, not so old, we all need to rediscover, and singing gives us that. So we can look back into, kind of going back into time. And if we lose those songs, Just like, good God, rap versus, the music that I grew up with. If we lose this song from the 60s or the 70s, you lose the history. So the thing about my presentation is that George is raised in a time when it has been assumed for 1,000 years or more that there is a king over us, that there is someone whom God has appointed by divine right, right? The thing I'm wearing here is called the gorget. Say gorget. It means the throat. It is the last vestige of medieval armor to protect your throat. It was much bigger, and it went here so you didn't get that lance right up into your throat. It was a weak spot in the armor. This became a symbol of being on duty. If some of you were in the military, thank you for your service, you know what an officer of the day is. So it's like an on-duty badge. So if I'm wearing my gorget, which means the throat, is French, what in français, it shows that I am on duty, that I am under arms. This is an arm, this is an arm, and that musket behind me is an arm. People can see I brought that in because I like props. But also because it's an extension of your throwing arm. So when we talk about the right to keep and bear arms, this is an arm. It's not a thermonuclear missile with, heat-seeking hellfire put on a, Apache helicopter. That's on an arm, you can't pick it up. And a gun in the 18th century is not what we consider to be a gun in the 21st century. It is a cannon. So if you go down a Stony Point battlefield, you can see the gun. So that's the thing about thinking. So we think differently in the 21st century. Here is a flag that shows what the spirit of the American Revolution was. Everyone seen this? A lot of people fly this, a lot of people put it back in their automobiles. People have different reasons, and they have adopted this flag for different purposes. But essentially, this is called the Gadsden flag. This really is the first flag of the United States of America. People don't realize, or if you do realize this, after 9/11, a version of this flag in which you have a rattlesnake coiled or a copperhead on the stars, or excuse me, on the stripes, 13 stripes, because that really is the first flag that they used for battle, 13 stripes. Everybody representing? 13 stripes? We're one of them, by the way. The colors. And the first 13 states. New York, huzzah, not huzzah, huzzah is a 19th century cheer. Huzzah for New York State, because we're still one of the original 13 states. All right, and that's the reason why we honor those 13 states with the stripes. We have 50 states, and we also have new states like Nebraska, Hawaii, and those things, and they are stars. But the star representing the state is really, I tell my students, I tell you, you're the star. Because you are the people of we the people of the United States. And that's what George talked about in his farewell address. Because he was a unifier of the people. So this flag, called the Gadsden flag, is now flown on every U.S. naval ship since 9/11. And what it represents is what I think the spirit of America is. It's a rattlesnake, and he's coiled up. And anybody who's ever been out in the woods at Kakiak Park, and I was a park ranger, I used to go out there all the time, and stepped over a rattlesnake one time. When they coil, what do they do when you walk by them? They spring. But before that, because of their... Don't tread on me. Very good, Mr. Krause. Yes, the rattlesnake doesn't want to bite you as a human being, that you're not its prey. It senses your heat, and it warns you. So something bigger, the snake is saying, listen, you come near me any further, you tread on my rights, we'll sting you all the way to Boston, as it was said during the Lexington and Concord. So like a rattlesnake, coiled, okay, it represents also that we in America believe in the liberty and that we are the individuals that have the right from God to defend ourselves, our family, our country, our county, our town, ourselves with force of arms. That's an interesting concept, sometimes abused by people, but that's not what I'm here for. But that represents that we have the power behind be arms. So the rattlesnake, and George Washington understood this, not only because he was from Virginia, but because he knew what military life was like. He knew what military power was like. I'm not going to say this to you, but I will. Whenever I go to students, I go, book. See? Book, good. Book have no screen. Book is interactive though, see? As a teacher, we're talking about, get the students involved in interactive. I said, here's your interactive multimedia device from the 18th century. This is one of the beautiful things about how our country came together in history. The Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, the idea that, kings and popes and potentates and things like that, while important in their roles, they are not our rulers. You are the star on the flag. You are the rulers of the United States of America. Everybody else, and this goes back to space, is a public servant. When I was a teacher, I was a public servant. When I was a county park ranger, I was a public servant. My job was not to tell people, I don't like that shirt you're wearing there. You got to take that off. Right? Don't you know that I make all the decisions? No. My job was to protect the county's property and to respect my bosses, who are the citizens of Rockland County. Now, we had a county truck, which, you couldn't just get into the truck and drive it. I used to call it the people's truck, but the people can't drive it unless they have permission. But we understand this because when we read George Washington, imagine, let's go back to when we were 21. Imagine us. George Washington at 21 is sent by, and I'll read this, the Journal Major George Washington sent by the Honorable Robert Dinwiddie, Esquire, His Majesty's Lieutenant Governor and Commander-in-Chief of Virginia, to the Commandant of the French forces on Ohio. Now this is important because at one time France was our enemy. Under the colonial system in the British Empire, England and France were rivals. Think about this today when we talk about foreign influences and foreign governments and military actions and things like that. It's the same. So Washington goes and he is a brash man of action, and he shows up in what's called Jumonville Glen today, where Fort Necessity is. This is in western Pennsylvania, in the Pittsburgh area, to say, the king says you're trespassing on our land. The French officers are, no, mon Dieu, you are trespassing on our land. This is called a conflict because they are fighting over land. Land is important. If I went to your house, put my flag up, started eating your food, mowing your lawn, enjoying your tennis court, you would say, you're my property, get off my property. So this is basically to put it in the base form. So Washington learns how things work as a young 21-year-old. He literally starts the French and Indian War. How many knew that? George Washington becomes world known for starting. There's 5 colonial wars with England and France. George Washington starts the last one that we know, of course, is the French and Indian War. Audience participation, who knows what it's called in Europe? It's called the French and Indian War. Remember Europe, 30 Years' War, 100 Years' War. The 7 Years' War. Does it last how many years? 7 years. So George learns to be an officer, and he learns the difference between the colonial and the Native American way of doing warfare, okay, which you have to, see, again, it's not, we don't teach white history, black history, Indian history. We teach American history, which involves every race and creed and color and ethnicity on the planet Earth, okay? So when I talk about history, George Washington is a product of his historical times, just like space is a product of the history and the times in which we founded the organization. So, this is the famous, everybody knows this one. What flag? Seamstress from Philadelphia.
Betsy Ross.
Betsy Ross.
Betsy Ross, very good. Never flown, never documented to have flown anywhere during the American Revolution. What you would have probably seen is the 13 stripes, okay? It's a pattern, Congress adopted it, but this is what comes to symbolize the American Revolution. So when I was a child, at 12 years old, my friend Scott Ryan and I, we used to go and play at Stony Point Battlefield. How many's been to the Stony Point Battlefield? Yeah. I grew up 3 miles from Stony Point Battlefield. Had no idea. This Stony Point that we live in is history. It is American history right up close. 1/3 of the battles of the Revolution fought in the state of New York. I don't know if anybody knew that. New York State is probably the most single state. Every state says this, but I can back it up with facts. Saratoga, okay, Stony Point, New York. The Battle of New York, the first battle was fought in the Battle of New York. The Hudson River that we all love to maybe boat and travel was the highway west to Point, whom as it was said at the beginning, I have a British officer, his name is Francis Tew. You can go and see his sign. If you go to Stony Point, it's right across from the entranceway to the visitor center. His name was Francis Tew. He was the oldest captain in the British Army. He was distinguished in the battles in the Caribbean, and they sent him to Stony Point to recuperate. So he shows up there, he's literally the oldest captain, but he was honored by King George III. So that's the first two, that's the Tale of Two Tews. The second one is not a Tew, he's a Gibbons. My mother's maiden name is Gibbons, and he was an American lieutenant. And he, later on after the Battle of Stony Point, became a captain because he led one of the columns. That man Anthony Wayne. Okay. George Washington, if you go up to Buckburg Road, Buckburg Mountain, you can see the sign. George Washington and Anthony Wayne, some people tell me this in the Boy Scout camp when I was a kid, that's crazy to us. Espied, spyglass. Oh yes, Anthony, I can see that, yes. Yeah. I think if you go from the right and have a feint up the center, we can defeat the British at their post. That's a spyglass. So the reason I wrote that, you have to look forward, and space has always been about that. We're looking at the plan of this community and this town. So like Washington, who was here, who was camped on Buckburg Mountain, he didn't fight the battle, Mad Anthony Wayne did it. And by the way, he's not mad because he's mad because he's bold and reckless, and he's a man of action. Another one of the historical figures that relates back to the action part of Stony Point Action Committee for the Environment. Do you sense the pattern of history? So when we talk about the action that George Washington took, he took it right here. My other ancestor by marriage, you might know, is a fellow who was very much involved here. In fact, the house where he committed his treason, called the Treason House, one of the copies, or the Treason House, still exists, and Mr. Casey talked about that thing. So his name, there's no airports named for him, there's no highways named for him, there are no bridges named for him. Anybody know?
Benedict Arnold.
Benedict Arnold, very good. Yes. That's why I tell people that's why I do the British. I used to mow Major Andre's gravesite, which if you go to the 76 house, awesome food, great atmosphere. And I was a county park ranger, and they dispatched me to go up and mow this little 10-foot square monument to a British spy. And I used to say, why am I mowing the grave of a British spy? By the way, he's buried in Westminster Abbey.